this lecture, we are going to be discussing the American sociologist Luther Bernard. Luther Bernard was born in 1881 in Kentucky, though he spent his childhood in western Texas, moving there at a young age. He left Texas to go to school at the University of Missouri, as well as a small school in Missouri. At the University of Missouri, he met the well-known sociologist Charles Elwood. He would go on to receive his PhD from the University of Chicago, and at the time there were very big players in sociology there. It's today, in fact, during this period, the Chicago school of that period has still kept its lasting influence in the discipline. By all accounts, Luther Bernard had a very prickly personality. He was hypersensitive, but also very prone to anger. He would get in all types of quarrels with scholars and people in his family, and he became furious with many of his fellow sociologists. He was heavily influenced by August Comte, who we discussed earlier this semester. He had clashes with people such as faculty members at the University of Chicago. For Luther, he thought that Chicago was being overly theoretical. Luther contended that they needed to be more methodologically sophisticated. These clashes became so extreme that Chicago, after Luther Bernard had gotten his PhD at Chicago, the faculty there told him that they would advise that he please not ask them for any assistance with his career moving forward. Luther Bernard's wife, Jessie Bernard, developed a more lasting name as a feminist scholar. Many sociologists today do not know who Luther Bernard is, which is unfortunate because he is the most important historian of social science, perhaps at least in the United States. He might be the most important historian of social science. Jessie Bernard has been remembered as a feminist scholar. Luther met Jessie when Luther was her professor. Luther was 40 years old and a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota when he met his future wife, Jessie Ravitch, a 17-year-old freshman in his class. Jessie worked as Luther's unpaid research assistant. Purely professionally speaking, she was very much helped by Luther to be the research assistant for a major player in sociology at a very young age of 17 or 18. That's some very serious help in one's career, and some very early help as well that other freshmen in college certainly do not receive that type of intellectual advantage. However, personally, Luther might have not helped her so much. They had a very bitter marriage. Jessie was Jewish, and Luther would often disparage her for being Jewish. He was, an anti-Semite. He was a sexist, and Jessie would sometimes internalize Luther's anti-Semitism and sexism, even exhibiting them herself, striving for Luther's favor. Kind of similar to the dynamic of double consciousness offered by Du Bois, where the marginalized person sees themselves and accepts the perception of the oppressor. Jessie Bernard was seeing herself through the eyes of Luther in many ways, because we have documentation showing that she herself would exhibit anti-Semitism despite the fact that she was Jewish. She herself would say things that would today at least be considered to be rather sexist, and even in connection to her own behavior and her own thinking. There's also correspondence between them. They wrote many letters together since both of them were often on the road. And they're very, I've gone through them. The archives are housed at Penn State, where I went to graduate school, and it seems like a very bitter marriage. They show that, a constant antagonism between the two, and even reveal the fact that Luther had at least once struck Jessie, physically assaulted her. As I said, Luther was well known during his time. He was the American Sociological Association president, in fact, though he is not really all that well known today. He was instrumental in starting the American Sociological Review, which is either the first or second best journal, depending on who you ask in sociology today. He created this journal because University of Chicago, where he had won some enemies, was in control of American Journal of Sociology, which would American Journal of Sociology and American Sociological Review are the top two journals in sociology today. He said that he created this new journal, American Sociological Review, somewhat out of vengeance because he thought that the University of Chicago had become arrogant and wanted to dominate the discipline to an unwarranted degree. He was also founding editor of The American Sociologist, which is another highly esteemed journal in sociology still today. So Luther Bernard was very interested in the history of sociology. Jessie was not to the same extent, though she would at least not when she was working for Luther as a research assistant, though she would later on become troubled by her students' lack of interest in the history of sociology and saw the value in it. As she worked for Luther as her unpaid research assistant, he had somewhat of a domineering attitude, barking orders at her, etc., telling her to do things that she simply wasn't all that interested in. She did work that Luther would ultimately receive the lion's share of credit for. Luther died in State College, Pennsylvania in 1951. Jessie was a professor at Penn State, which is in State College, Pennsylvania, and she would die in 1993. Okay, so we're going to discuss a book called Origins of American Sociology that they wrote together. It's a very large book. It's arguably the most comprehensive history of pre-sociology in the United States. It's a book that helped Luther become known as the discipline's leading historian. Fellow sociologist Reed Bain claimed that the book's treatment of the subject is so complete that there will be neither need nor material for more than an occasional article on the subject in the future. He went on to predict that it will be valuable to all historians of ideas, students of social movements, and all who are curious about the origin of American sociology. Of course, this ended up being an overly optimistic prediction from Reed Bain because Origins of American Sociology is hardly read by anybody, unfortunately, today. In preparing Origins of American Sociology, Jessie Bernard was a PhD student at the time, and she undertook the study of Auguste Comte's influence on American social science. As we covered a little bit earlier this semester, Comte had a very large influence on U.S. pre-social science and social science still today. They thought that Origins of American Sociology could be used as a textbook in the future, but as I said, it has been more or less tossed into the scholarly dustbin. Origins of American Sociology provides detailed accounts on the philosophical underpinnings of social science in the 18th century, particularly focusing on its close relation to ethical theory, and by the mid-19th century they show that social science began to reshape as an increasing number of scholars became critical of its utopian aspects and general lack of data, whereas before there was theological accounts and accounts of ethical philosophy that was guiding social thought during this period. Social scientists wanted to see more empirical social science being relied upon in sociology. According to Luther and Jessie Bernard, there was an infusion of this scientific aspect of into the social thought at the time, which connected to, quote unquote, the growing conviction in the minds of men that the methods of science in general should be applied to social problems in their solution as well as to the physical world, and that mystical solutions should be discarded. So, to much in a very Comtean language, there is this contention that theology and metaphysics must be overcome, and we must realize a positivist scientific empirical stage, and that this empirical stage should be oriented toward the solution of social problems. So very much in the same way that Comte writes that positivism is the ultimate goal for social science, that we need to bring sociology into its positivist phase. We again see this in American social science with this idea that theology and metaphysics must be overcome for the realization of a positivist social science and ultimately a positivist society. The Bernards repeatedly described this period of social science as that which had to supersede both the theological and metaphysical stages in order to advance toward the positivist system of knowledge. For example, they wrote that, quote, "The theologians did not welcome the efforts of the philosophers to analyze society and offer a theory and a plan for its improvement." Harriet Martineau freely translated and condensed Auguste Comte's Positive Philosophy in 1853, and in doing so, Auguste Comte reached the height of his influence in the United States. Comte was better and more widely understood, as previous translations were not comprehensible to English readers, but Martineau's contribution allowed us to understand what Comte was writing for social scientists who did not speak French. With this translation, a period of, quote, "admiration, attack, criticism, praise, violent repudiation, and equally violent espousal ensued. Comte received many admirers, many friends, many proponents of positivist sociology. But he also received an equal number, many enemies, fierce resistors to the overcoming of theology and metaphysics and toward a positivist system." It is unfortunate that rather than focusing on the arguments of those who disagreed with Comte's vision of positivist sociology, Luther and Jesse Bernard instead resort to ad hominem attacks in a very immature way. They focus on just sort of claiming that those who are resistant to Comte's system at the time were cowardly, that they were showing timidity, that they had small minds. They use language like this, but they don't really unpack the arguments and respond to the arguments in any sort of dispassionate way. That being said, it is true that this was somewhat going both ways. I mean, many of the critics of Comte who did not want to see a positivist system materialize attacked Comte because, as we covered earlier this semester, Comte had periods of mental instability and even checked into a mental health hospital and attempted suicide. His opponents thus used these matters to try to discredit his positivist system. Rather than criticize the argument itself, they made very ugly attacks against Comte's mental instability. But Luther and Jesse Bernard do no better of just resorting to mere insults rather than unpacking and dissecting the arguments of those who were resisting Comte. They write that opposition to Comte was a petty and invidious criticism leveled at the system by the smaller minds. This notwithstanding, it is still the case that the Bernards were able to rely on their historical knowledge through this massive project of Origins of American Sociology as a means to contextualize their contemporaries' views as being rooted in past intellectual battles. So, to better understand their current moment when they were writing in the early to mid-20th century, they used their historical knowledge to understand the roots out of which their current arguments developed, that being pre-sociology in the United States with these battles over Comtean philosophy. Origins of American Sociology thus was meant to serve as a reminder to Bernard's contemporaries of the devotion to not only positivistic advancement, but also to the ethics and social reform out of which sociology was born. There's also a project that Luther had that became known as Luther's Onion Skins. This is a project that he never quite finished. He used some of the onion skins for some of his published projects, though he had a larger project in mind that he never completed. For this project, the onion skins, Luther sent questionnaires asking about origins and current details on each social science department, as well as for professional autobiographies from the scholars to whom he wrote. He sent hundreds and hundreds of inquiries, trying to collect as much data about the discipline as he possibly could. The data in these hundreds of responses gave Luther a wide encompassing comprehension of his contemporaries' views on social science, as well as detailed departmental information. they still comprise the single best and broadest source of data about this period of American sociology today. Many of the scholars who came before the Bernard's period were influenced by Christian principles and ethical philosophizing. It is true that sociology was heavily influenced in the United States by sort of Christian ethics, but most sociologists by the early 20th century were attempting to marginalize religious sociology. They saw it as a stage of thought to be overcome. They also thought the same way about metaphysics. Again, Comte's system starts with theology, though this is considered to be childlike thinking according to Comte. Metaphysics is also could be a progression, but it is also a stage of thought that must be overcome. The goal, they say, is the positivist stage. The responses at Luther showed these sort of Comtean patterns. They showed that the majority of the Bernard's contemporaries believed that social progress and the advancement of knowledge depended upon realizing the positivist stage. However, they had different understandings of what was entailed in what the positivist stage was, some of which thought that the positivist stage should be value imposing, some thought that it should be value neutral. Luther was known to have unusually high academic standards. Some have even described it as astronomically high academic standards. He was a bit of a freak. He lived to work, and even just this onion skins project that he set up for himself, he never finished it because he set up a project for himself that was quite an ambitious task that was probably would be too much to chew for any sociologist. When he would write these onion skin letters to fellow sociologists at the time, they would reply in a way that seemed to reveal that they shared that their perception of him was that he had very unusually high standards, that he was committed to an insane amount of work. In 1928, for example, Raymond Pearl of Johns Hopkins responded to Bernard writing, quote, "You say in your letter that not much time will be required for complete answers. I marvel at this statement." Ray E. Wakely also replied, "I did not suppose it was possible for a man to ask so many questions on one small postcard." Anthropologist Nell C. Nelson replied to Bernard's questionnaire saying, "I am slightly stunned by the list of questions you submit and the statement that you have only 2 months in which to prepare your assignment." We have a similar response from this sociologist to whom Luther Bernards wrote, where he says, "Quite frankly, I may say that your letter and questionnaire for your article on the history of the social sciences terrifies me. To reply with anything approaching the fullness you suggest would take about a week's solid work, since it would involve 1. Looking up a mass of details of all sorts, and 2. A great deal of careful thought. For what you ask for is a history of the department and all its members, a history of the whole discipline of the United States and its influence on the department, ditto in the whole of Europe, a critical study of all the great leaders in the subject here and abroad, together with bibliographies of their most important works, and finally an analytical biography of myself. To comply with your request to answer all the queries fully would result in a monograph of at least 100 pages. Those who responded to Bernard's inquiries frequently showed this sort of Comtean system in their responses, referring to the construction of positivist sociology and therefore consequent jettisoning of the theological and metaphysical modes of thought as a prerequisite for the eradication of social problems. Many of the sociologists Bernard wrote to had training in theological seminaries and were abandoning this training. There was a massive abandonment of theology during this period in sociology. They wished to have a scientific outlook. Some even put forth that they think that it was possible for sociology to develop into something of a hard science, writing, quote, "I am now interested especially in developing a science of sociology and putting it on a plane that could be used by the practical man as are chemistry and physics." While it is true that the majority of sociologists to whom Luther wrote believed that we should overcome theology, overcome metaphysics, and reach a positivist system, and then use this positivist system to reform society, there are some sociologists who disagreed. A minority of respondents said that such positivist or scientific dominance would overlook the value of humanities, overlook the value of ethics, overlook the value of philosophy. There's also some disagreement concerning whether or not positivism should be value-free or value-neutral. Luther, for example, had a value-imposing positivism, meaning that these results should be used to help reform society. It could be a scientific sociology while also being a sociology that was meant to solve social problems, whereas others would say, to heck with reforming society, I want to study society. A value that it would be, that latter one would be the value neutral stance. I will read you a quote from one of the responses. This sociologist had Robert E. Park as a professor in their graduate training. Robert E. Park, if you don't know, is a very famous American sociologist, and he talks about being in the classroom with Park and some of the things that Park was saying. This person writes, Park had been repeating the expressions, taking the objective point of view of society, taking a detached attitude toward human nature, studying social and personality problems like a biologist does a bedbug, etc., etc., until one day I grew violent within and questioned his motives in this question. Professor Park, if I were sick by the roadside and you, a physician, having a scientific attitude of mind, such as you have in sociology, should observe me in pain, what would you do with me? He instantly replied, probably I would experiment upon you. Then the whole class laughed, and so did I. But it was not a laugh offered in compensation for defeat, but a hearty laugh of victory. For the first time in my life, I got my first conception of the object of a science. Before this time, I had been subjective in my attitudes. I had been entering into every social situation, not with the idea of understanding it, but to condemn or praise it as the case may be. Taking sides was an outstanding trait in my teaching of sociology up to this time. These types of disagreements concerning whether or not taking sides should play a role in sociology persist today. Some argue that we should be value neutral, that we should try to study society in a nearly identical manner to the way in which we study chemistry and physics, etc., and that we do not impose our values, we do not impose any sort of intentions for the ways in which we believe that reform, that social reform should come about. From this side, proponents say that reformists are humanistic reactionaries, that they're pulled by emotion, that they're pulled by ideology, and they wish that they will simply disappear into the dustbin of history. Others argue for what is referred to as a public sociology, seeing sociology not just as a science, but as a moral and political force. So here we have, there's an advantage to understanding the history of the discipline, because much of the same arguments that are taking place in sociology today, patterns of these dynamics can be found about 100 years ago, and then even more if we could trail back to pre-sociology before then. So there's this advantage for social scientists to better understand their history, and many of them don't. Many graduate students who seek PhDs in sociology do not know one single thing about the history of their discipline. And it's a shame, because it really results in this in the fact that they don't know anything. They can't really understand why it is that we have certain values and priorities for our current disciplinary moment. They can't understand our current penchant for theories and topics and why those theories and topics. They can't understand the more, let's say, non-intellectual aspects that have led to an intellectual appearance in current intellectual battles. It is a scary thing to have scholars be caring about their work in such a ignorant manner. So we are going to discuss sociological research and the exceptional man. This was a presidential address delivered before the American Sociological Association in 1932 by Luther Bernard. Luther Bernard says that to In order to improve the quality of research, we must pay attention to the researcher. The researcher is a person, not an objective entity that is according with objective reality in leading to this piece of research, but rather that research must be understood as being a highly personal matter. He goes on to tell us that no scientific method can replace high intellect of the researcher, that we can't just mindlessly push out results, that there needs to be a sufficient mind guiding the research. He writes, quote, "For there are fads and fashions and even crazes among the sciences, as well as in the less dignified affairs of life." Much in the same way that there are mindless fads, mindless fashions throughout society, these social scientists must rid themselves of this belief that they are themselves not a part of society, that they are not somehow, there's this idea that they're somehow floating above the society, floating above their subjects, that they're just simply the observers, when in fact they are very much a part of that which they are studying because they are a part of society. They are also subjected to fads and fashions, which tend to be very anti-intellectual. Thus, anti-intellectual influences could enter into intellectual spaces such as academia. We still see this in sociology today. He also mentions that there is a sort of sad superiority that researchers feel for teachers. Some professors, if you don't know, have a heavy research load, whereas some have a heavy teaching load, and there's a sort of hierarchy that is implied sometimes where research professors think more of themselves than teaching professors. Bernard argues that this type of mindset of feeling superior to professors who focus more on teaching is a dangerous divorce of research from citizenship. When he's going about talking about how there are fads and fashions in the social sciences, and when he says that research is a highly personal matter, he does not want to be misunderstood as arguing that sociology should be entirely speculative. He's not saying that we need to descend into metaphysical assertions and speculation. He wants sociology to be positivist, to be factually based, but he does not want sociologists to not have a sufficient outlook of life either. He does not want them to mindlessly plug away with number crunching. He wants them to be thoughtful, to be contemplative, to read carefully, to be knowledgeable and broadly informed. For, quote, "At the back of every piece of worthwhile research there must be a competent mind with a sufficiently broad and well-informed outlook." There's a danger in the social sciences where research is considered to be just shoving out tables and figures, typically by people who don't really know much about the topic that the tables and figures are supposed to give us a better understanding of. There is a weird anti-reading, anti-thinking atmosphere that enters into quantitative sociology. He says, quote, "It is entirely possible to have moronic research as any other form of moronic thinking." He spoke in pretty blunt terms, as you could see. If we turn to page 6, I'm going to read you a short segment where he says, "After all, statistics is but a refined method of logic invented to make more precise the ordinary methods of thinking." Later down the page, "I think it could easily be proved that every one of the general principles of method the statisticians are triumphantly announcing today were earlier stated non-statistically by men who were not statisticians, but who had a keen perception of the general logic of behavior and of events. Some of the statisticians, who are microscopists rather than macroscopists in logic, do not realize that this is true. There are many tools to research, that some are better adapted to one purpose than others to other purposes, and that none are useful except as they are manipulated by a competent and well-trained workman." So every important research contribution has been made by sociologists who are both generalizers and technicians, people who have ideas and thoughts and sophisticated lines of reasoning, and be able to plug away and take part of the means of sociological research, meaning the methodological aspects of research. He expresses a fear that many sociologists seem to be law seekers. Social scientific laws do not exist in the structure of the universe, but rather are the products of human thinking. We cannot think about the social sciences in the same way that we could think about physics and chemistry, though there are some overlaps. He touches on one here saying, quote, even in physics and chemistry, there must be constant revision of generalizations. In the social sciences, where the data of generalizations are more complex, changeable, and abstract, this revision must occur more frequently. So yes, even in the harder sciences, generalizations need to be revised. Though in sociology, if you recall Comte's hierarchy of sciences, he discusses the ways in which social science is more complex than the basic sciences of mathematics and physics, etc. Again, as a reminder, more complex does not mean more difficult. By more complex, we are not saying that social sciences are hard and natural sciences are easy. That's not what we mean at all. Complexity is determined by the extent to which a science is dependent upon human action.